Hey guys, we're going to go ahead and begin. So thank you guys for coming to our second CARE seminar of the semester. Today our speaker is Scott Pfeiffer of Threshold Acoustics. And so let me give a brief introduction. So Scott Pfeiffer works in architectural acoustics, and with acoustics as his main interest, he completed a Bachelor of Science in Physics with honors in music at Moravian College, and then moved on to graduate studies in the acoustics laboratory at the Technical University of Denmark. His recent projects include the National Arts Center in Ontario, Rice University Music and Performing Arts Center, the Kennedy Center Memorial Interpretation Project, and the University of Wisconsin Eau Claire Confluence Center. Scott has been honored as a fellow in the Acoustical Society of America for his accomplishments in the design of worship and performing arts spaces. He's also served on the Knowles Hearing Center Advisory Board at Northwestern University and is an emeritus board member of the University of Nebraska Lincoln-Durham School Architectural Engineering Industry Advisory Committee. He is currently the president-elect for the National Council of Acoustical Consultants. He's also a three-chord guitar player who likes to sing around the campfire with his wife, their travel trailer, and their dog. So welcome, Scott, and take it away.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you all today. What I thought I'd talk to you about is borrowed heavily from a webinar I did for the Acoustical Society. The part I thought was helpful was that it was focused on how we as acousticians are not always understood by our colleagues. When you're out and about and someone says, "What do you do?" and you say, "Oh, I'm an acoustician of any kind," you get a really funny look. And so it becomes really important to communicate about what we do in a way that that is accessible for people. And that's important for us as well, because all of our clients are not expert in what we do. And so finding a way to deliver our value in a way that's readily understood is important. So I'm going to talk about three things in total. One is about that communication aspect. The other is about human connection and what spaces we create can do to improve our connection to one another, which is a funny thing to talk about in the midst of a pandemic, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then finally, I'm going to try to get through what we have done in acoustics to talk about what we have left to do as a profession, and some of the challenges we still face in that regard. So without further ado, I'll keep going. There was a Southwest Airlines feature that got hung on our fridge in the office, and they do a by the numbers series. And one of them was a full page photo of kid scientists and the headline that said 69% of parents have no idea what their adult children do for a living. And I think it's hung around on our fridge for so long because our staff identify with this statement. The goal of the article and of a LinkedIn movement was to create a thing called Bring Your Parents to Work Day, which is celebrated by no one as far as I can find, but it is on November 4th. It's coming up. So if you want to restart this trend or attempt to make it happen, we could do that together and try to help our parents understand what it is we do. Ultimately, being an acoustical consultant, or worse, an acoustician, becomes a really hard thing to describe and help people to understand. And so I thought we'd talk a little bit about how that affects the way we do our work. In a similar way, Benjamin Zander, who's a conductor in New England, in the Boston area, did a TED Talk. And in that TED Talk, he identified the fact that he, as the conductor, doesn't make a sound. You know, his picture's on the cover of the album, but he depends on others for his power and ability to make other people powerful. Our work is similar. We advise architects on the shape of the walls, the materials we need, the setup, the criteria for engineering firms to work out the mechanical engineering, but they produce the design. If it doesn't end up on their drawings, it doesn't get built. And so in a sense, we are only as good as the level of empowerment we give to others in order to affect what it is that we try to create. I had this video clip that I wanted to share, and as of this morning, it stopped working. So I'll just tell you what it's about. These two consultants are in front of a guy, and they say, hey, we think you should do A, B, C, and D. And he says, thoughtfully, great, let's do it. And they respond to him. It's a UPS commercial. I don't know why. They say, well, we don't do what we recommend. We just recommend. And I thought it was helpful to think about that if we're not careful and we don't help really inform people on how to do what we're suggesting they need to do, or make it really easy for them, we risk being dismissed as these consultants that aren't really effective. And so you can look it up sometime, UPS consultants, and you'll get a kick out of it. It's funny. A little too close to home sometimes, I think, but that's okay. So if I get to, there we go. So, along those lines, it's important for us to influence this large group of people to get to an outcome that we would like to reach. So one example might be this recent project that was mentioned in my bio, which is the design of an opera house for Rice University. We worked together from the very beginning with the architects and the theater consultants and the structural engineers and the mechanical engineers and the lighting consultants and others, including the construction team, to communicate to them about the really important features of this building and how they will need to go together in order for it to be successful. The project began in 2013 and is only just completed last year. And so right there, you can see that this is a 7-year journey where somebody has an idea about this image at the end that they want to achieve. And the number of decisions we have to make together along the way leads a friend of mine to call this endurance art. That there is not an immediate gratification involved here. 7 years ago, somebody said, or 8, somebody said, I'd like to have an opera house. And at long last, that comes to fruition. And it doesn't happen without being really clear about the purpose and the goal, which the university did by identifying, we want an opera house for 600 people. We need an orchestra pit that holds 70 players. We need those 70 players to be in balance with a single singer on stage so that they can be blend together and present their art in the right way. And then we work with this large team of expertise in order to arrive at the end where each of those boxes are checked and the mechanical systems are quiet and the structure is appropriately separated so that noises outside of the building are not disruptive to what happens inside. And the arrangement of space is done in such a way that sets can seamlessly come on and off stage, and actors have a path to stage where they need to be in order to be effective. And so it's only by that collaboration among that large team, all understanding what that single purpose is at the end, that really gets us there. And there's a place where here on the lower sidewall, we really wanted to bring audience in from the front so that you could get accessible seating in the front row. And we also wanted this row of seats to be really close to stage so that you could almost feel that you could reach out and shake the hand of the person who is on stage seated there, so that there's a real intimacy to help a student performer feel connected to their audience. Just to accomplish that, all of the building services that have to cross through this pathway have to be done in a very tight way, small circumstance. And so it's moments in the building like that where we can go to the contractor and say, we really need you to recognize that you can't just willy-nilly throw stuff in here. It's got to fit through in a really organized way. And we're going to make your life difficult to try to accomplish that. But when the project is done, we want you to come up and sit in one of those seats and feel how close to stage you are. If we had given you an extra 1.5 feet to just run electrical and plumbing and piping and ductwork, you would be pushed further away, and we'd lose some of that magic that comes down to inches. And so that collaboration involves communication, and that communication is oftentimes around a table, sometimes through technology, and we keep track of a lot of details, on Post-its and through sketches, and we navigate And we need all these ways of communicating in order to be really effective. Of course, more and more of this is moving online, but ultimately, this kind of communication has to sometimes get tense. We are in competition for space. We are in where creative ideas are being put on the table and need to be critiqued in order to get to the right outcome. And critique is hard unless you have a really good relationship with the people who you are critiquing. And so what seemed like pleasantries, where you showed up and had a box of donuts on the table and talked about the weather and the travel to get you to the place where you met, are all things that when you take them away, reduce the level of connection we have with one another, so that when it comes time to present a critique, it can be more stressful, harder to accomplish that shared goal of a result that recognizes everyone's best talents and allows us to know one another well enough to take risks and work together to get to a really special outcome. Clearly, that in-person one-on-one communication has to extend, and sometimes our work is about giving people the tools to present from one person to a larger group. And these settings, expanded settings, require a series of technology or environments in which communication can happen in all the ways that it needs to, whether that's just allowing for multiple conversations to occur within the same room by taking all the right steps in how that room is treated so that those conversations are not wildly overpowering to the room, or if it's setting up the right communication area so that one person can effectively, with large enough resources, share with the entire room, and there's opportunity to spin your chair around and talk to the people behind you in a breakout session. Or you have the right tools in a setting to have a comfortable place to sit, share a long period of time comfortably, and get the message that's being delivered from a much more formal stage. Each of these environments requires a certain attention about the acoustics and the technologies that go into them. And that's where we focus our time in assuring that can be the case. And then, of course, you can extend even further to larger audiences where practiced presentation, rehearsal upon rehearsal, leads to an outcome that has been crafted for that moment of performance, of live performance to a live audience. And in that moment, that connection is enabled by the architecture that surrounds it. And the experience you will have will be shaped by the way that room has been built, and what we need to do in order to arrive at that opportunity. When we think about how to do all of this, we return to the most basic of principles, that there's an evolutionary basis to the development of our hearing, and that acoustic comfort depends on an awareness of how the organ on the side of our head works, that allows us to process oral sounds from our environment and makes us comfortable. This tremendous sense of hearing allows us to place or understand the presence of all of those performers on stage, intuitively or through the processing in the brain. And if we ignore the sensitivity of our instrument on our heads, then we can miss out on the real opportunity to create spaces, whether for communication one-on-one or all the way up to performance. Those spaces have to be attentive to what makes us comfortable. In the presence of noise, we find that the WHO has done studies, and much more is out and about how that induces stress. And those things are linked to this evolutionary basis, where in our surroundings, in the outdoors, you can hear things and know what to ignore because it doesn't present danger, or what you need to focus on because it may be a clue. If you bring yourself indoors and add noise, your brain is stuck in a questioning mode of, do I need to hear something that is being covered up by that noise? And is it something that I need to be worried about? And therefore your stress levels rise. And oftentimes in-person settings, we'll generate noise in the background when people come into the room for a presentation. And at this point in the presentation, I would remove the noise and I can watch the audience in those circumstances. And you see their shoulders drop and they sit back in their chair more comfortably. And so we know both intellectually and in practice that noise adds stress. And so when we design indoor spaces and environments, we want to be sure that we're not masking those cues that allow us to relax and say, no, I'm in a safe place. I can give my full attention to the activity in front of me, and I don't have to be bothered. We need these tools still today as we wander about our normal world. What used to be the tiger that might be snapping a branch behind us we should listen for, now, if we travel around without our headphones in, we can also use those same navigation techniques to protect us from the world around us. And so there's some need to remain plugged in to the world that's around us by unplugging from what we carry with us. As we think about just taking that innate capability of focus and attention into the realm of real exchange of information, we think about the simplest forms where people communicate. And those might include the gathering around a campfire and storytelling, and that those settings exhibit for us what is the ideal in performing arts design. Each person can be heard if they're leading the story, they're readily audible because you're in close proximity. Both a quiet voice and a loud presence can both be acknowledged easily and recognized for their dramatic contribution to the storytelling. Each person's reaction can be heard by everyone else. So if someone says, "ah," or "ooh," or that you're with a group of people who are listening to the events that unfold, and that reaction helps you to be part of the experience in the storytelling. And so to the degree we can, we want to extend that same experience to the largest auditoriums so that you not only hear what's happening on stage, but you also hear the collective response of your audience. And so as we develop these metaphors for places to communicate, the campfire is one and the cave is another, where the cave in historic and evolutionary sense provided protection, physical protection from the surroundings. It also represents architectural amplification. So if you make a sound or speak in a cave, you can certainly be heard over longer distances than around a campfire. And that level of architectural amplification becomes something very intentional in architectural acoustic design. And so we can think about how the walls that surround us also reinforce the sounds we make. And you'll know this if you ever, the cleverest of buskers certainly find the great places in subways and in street corners where they can back themselves up to a really strong, powerful surface and have their reach extended by the architectural amplification that's present from their enclosure. And so if you're with me so far, that our job is to enable communication through assistance to the architectural design team, and that each of these settings that are represented on the screen represent communication at different scales, but that share a fundamental need for quiet background, reinforced presence, and an awareness of your fellow audience member. The other concept that we can touch on as we move into this development of communication tools is that communication cannot be limited solely to intelligibility. That engineering of the telephone was amazing for identifying the minimum required signal content for us to hear and understand what was being said across the line. But this in-person communication requires much more in terms of fidelity, something that allows us not only to understand the words, but something that allows us to really connect with the presenter and the audience, to connect them together, so that beyond just words and understanding, we gather feeling and presentation and content, well beyond the simplest of communication. A an audio systems designer I worked with in New York once said of really directional loudspeakers that made sound really intelligible to the very back row, but left you with a thin, artificial sounding voice, that it was kind of like saying the surgery was successful, but the patient died. That ultimately you delivered the intelligible word, but you delivered none of the feeling that was supposed to come with it. And that doesn't allow you to reach the strength and power of presentation that a public address system needs to accomplish in order to be really useful. So this begins, of course, with noise-induced stress and removing that. I won't spend a lot of time on that today, although if there's time for questions at the end and we want to come back to this, we can. So much good work has been done in the world that we lean heavily upon. It is not work that we foundationally originate, so I think it's better left to another speaker to tackle some of this. But the resources are out there that really help to reinforce the importance of communication in a quiet environment, the lack of distraction, to allow life, not just communication, but life in a quiet environment. That if we can reduce the noise present in our commutes, in our travel from place to place, we can, and the places where we live and sleep and rest and recover, our health will be better for it. And so all of our efforts can be pointed towards design that makes people's surroundings better. So those resources exist, and we can come back to that. And we'll begin with the presumption that all of what happens from here happens in quiet surroundings. One of the places we've been able to participate that again requires some further study, and we're anxious to see where acoustics researchers like yourselves might end up in the world next, would be to introduce there's a group called the AnFA, the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. And a number of years ago, we got on their program in order to say an important part of neuroscience-based response to buildings is the way they sound. And there's not enough research happening yet in this area, and we'd love to encourage that so that we can more directly connect these ideas of how our surroundings and the way they sound affect the way we feel, our ability to retain information taken in under those circumstances, and so on and so forth. And so again, an encouragement more for future research than a presentation on my part. Though when this comes to how we apply our work to theater design, it becomes really important to think about the lessons we have available to us out in the world, the built laboratory of space that we can respond to and understand and use to learn more about how good design can take place going forward. The buildings like the Musikverein in Austria, it's thought of to be one of the greatest concert halls in the world. And one of the lessons that was taken from it readily was classical architecture is important to acoustics because you can see all this detailing in the balcony fronts and the carvings in these headers of these doors and the windows at the top of the room that have depth and articulation, that ultimately that kind of filigree and detail is important to make acoustics great. And it's true, it is. The lesson that was often missed, and we'll come to this a bit more later, was that the size and scale of each of these elements is quite different as you move from one to the next. These are quite small scale diffusive elements in the balcony front. They get to be more mid-scale as they sit in these forms, including the headers of the doors. Large scale when you introduce the windows at the top that are quite deep in their recess. And what was almost missed entirely in the review of this kind of architecture about a decade or two ago was that this entire surface is actually quite flat, as is the lower wall below the balcony. That there's important, in addition to the deep detail, is also the fact that there is strong, heavy, supportive surfaces that are unbroken so that you can replicate the original sound without distortion. And oftentimes this led to an overuse of diffusion in concert hall design, again, that we'll touch on in a little bit. Similarly, Boston Symphony Hall is thought of as one of the great halls. And again, oftentimes what you'll read about and hear about is the statuaries and the filigree and the coffering in the ceiling that all provide this great diffusion in order to create great sound in the room. And what no one had ever mentioned in any of the reviews of this building that we had read about in the beginning of my career were these big flat plaster surfaces that had no articulation whatsoever. And that is an important part of what makes this hall sound great as well. So in response, modern architecture adopted a new kind of diffusion, or in the 60s and 70s and 80s, if we can call that modern, comparatively to the Musikverein and Boston, adopted a modern recall of diffusion. The mistake that often got made at this period was that while there is diffusion present in these stepping forms underneath the balconies and in the ceiling in this hexagonal form, it is all of a similar scale. So whereas the other rooms really provided a variety of scales in order to respond to sound differently, this approach really used all similar sized elements and similar sized steps to create this kind of diffusion. And what happened as a result is that the room takes on a coloration that relates to those dimensions, the wavelengths of those dimensions, and creates a coloration that is not pleasant, that is something that still needs to be fixed in this room that we're working on with a study to renovate, but also that is missing the large flat surfaces that would have been useful to retain that original quality of the sound that leaves the stage. And so one of the challenges of all of this is that in talking about it, we end up saying the things I'm telling you, but this is a very intellectual argument. Better way for us to work with our clients is to get them out into rooms to hear things and to experience them for themselves. And then once they have an impression of what they like and don't like, we can use what we understand about the acoustics of the room to explain why one was preferred over the other. And so for the Rice project that I started with, we got the good fortune to take that client on a tour of opera houses in Paris, Prague, and London, and or the UK in general. And it allowed us to get into these rooms, see them and experience them and understand how firsthand how the acoustics varied among volumes of different shapes and sizes, and then how that might translate into acoustic differences. In their process, they narrowed it down to 2 rooms that really felt good to them, that assembled the right number of people around a stage, and that had very different acoustic characters, neither of which was good or bad, just that were different enough that they really wanted to explore further how to choose what direction to go for their own room. One of them was the Estates Theater in Prague. This is what's considered an Italianate opera house, style opera house. This is the room where Mozart composed Don Giovanni, and it was featured in the movie Amadeus a number of years ago, and got a nice renovation out of it so they could film the movie here. In the boxes, you look through an open window, essentially, onto the acoustic volume in the room. The box fronts are rather large, so they really define the acoustic volume as the interior of this horseshoe-shaped opera house. And the ceiling sits right on top of the boxes, continuation of the ceiling over the box. It's a very intense, tight volume. Presence is excellent, and your awareness of what's happening on stage is good. But the volume outside, the acoustic volume out here, is really thrown away. Any sound that gets into these boxes is lost to the rest of the room. And so that's one kind of acoustic aesthetic. The other was the Royal Opera at Versailles. This is inside the palace at Versailles. It was built as a wedding venue for the king's children and extended relatives. And you see that in this case, the lowest balcony sits forward, the next balcony is recessed back a bit, and so on, where the final balcony sits back beyond the acoustic volume, or beyond the drum of the horseshoe-shaped opera house, and each seating area is more fully exposed to the volume of the room. This leads to a sound that is much more reverberant and in some ways more pleasant. But again, it's not good or bad, it's just a difference of acoustic aesthetic. And so if you look at the two side by side, you can see how those differences might play out. As we work with this, then our next goal was to say, well, how can we help our client make a decision about these things? And each of these rooms had features that we thought were worth exploring. And so we not only modeled the original rooms themselves, but we also then improved on each of them by designing an opera house in today's standards that was inspired by each, and we could listen to them. We'll try this and see if it works, and you can all tell me if you're able to hear properly or not. And if you're not, we'll just move on. But we can then oralize from the room what it would sound like to sit in this seat, so that we can listen to the two side by side without having to jump on a plane and run from Prague to Versailles. So I'll just see if this plays. Thumbs up if you're hearing anything.
We can kind of hear it. It's pretty quiet.
Pretty quiet. Okay. Well, I won't try the side-by-side comparison in that case, and sorry for the technical difficulties. I could perhaps make the presentation available through a download site after the talk, and then you can listen to these yourself under better circumstances. So we were able to play the same piece of music performed similarly, anechoic recordings of that music, played through the models, and you could hear the difference between the two rooms from similar seats in those rooms. What this allowed us is not pretending that we can fully recreate the experience in either room, but it does allow us to separate the geometries and the choices made in architecture and say the only difference between these two samples is those changes in the physical changes in the model. And as a result, you can trust that the nature of the change is something you can expect to see in the final room. And it allows us to discuss acoustic aesthetic with our client. Oh, sorry, by playing this for them in our room, not through headphones, but in a room with a 22-channel surround setup where the center seat is the most accurate representation, but everyone in the room can share the experience together and weigh in on, here's what I'm hearing. I like this better than that. And these are all musical terms and language that they can use in their own voice that then allow us to translate that into decisions made about architecture and acoustics. And one of the best things about this is not just the communication between us and our client, but it's also the fact that they can communicate with each other. So, for example, while we were doing this process, there was a clear winner emerging, that there was a preference for the Royal Opera at Versailles sound, the acoustic aesthetic that went with that. And so, but the university architect, who was part of the decision-making body, said, I'm not hearing it. I don't hear the difference. What am I listening for? How do I, this is all hocus pocus. And the director of the opera program was able to say, oh, hold on. David, here's what I'm hearing. And he was explaining how the operatic voice is really present in two parts, simplified. One is the head voice, and it's the place where the power comes from to reach the back of the room. And it's not very pleasant. It's nasally, and he demonstrated, and he makes a sound, and he goes, oh, and you hear this nasally voice. And he says, that gives you the power to reach the back row. The rest of the body engages in the sound and adds the chest voice, adds the color, the resonance, and you get a warmer, more beautiful sound. He said, Prague the Estates Theater was all head voice for him, and Versailles was a good balance of both. And that explanation, then going back to listen again, the person who was struggling suddenly had something to key in on and listen for, and came away saying, aha, I hear the difference. I know what you're listening to, and now I get it. That conversation could have never occurred without the attempt to introduce experience into the decision-making process. No extrapolation on our part about the science of acoustics was going to get them across that hump to have that kind of communication. And so this would be one of the places where remembering that our job is not just to do great acoustics, but also to communicate about them in a way that is productive and useful is really where the power of the consulting process comes into the fore. And so you end up with a room at the end that is not only one that we feel good about acoustically, but one that the entire group that participated in making it so owns and has real ownership of the decisions that were made along the way, because they not only felt that they were included, but they were actually included, and they understood the choices they were making, which is an important component to that. All of this is for one purpose: it's to allow the most effective connection between a performer and their audience. Not about perfection. It's not about delivering a perfect performance. It's about achieving a level of shared experience that is different from what we might do in a studio. In a studio, the artist might spend days reworking a passage until they get it just right, and then put that down on the recording forevermore. In live performance, perfection is not our goal, but a unique experience that is worth showing up for, worth getting off the couch for, is what we're after. And so the uniqueness of experience that you might have from a rock show to a symphony to the variety of places you can be, or someone's living room, are all enabling live performance to happen in unique ways that might not reach an acoustic ideal, but are certainly acoustically appropriate and certainly acoustically interesting, becomes our goal. There are a number of again, the built laboratory that we have to draw on out in the world that tells us what works and what doesn't, allows us to really deeply understand this feature. And so you can travel around the world and listen to a variety of places, and you can, in that process, understand what each designer was after in their process. But it is not those that have gone for some mythical holy grail of perfect acoustics that are the most successful. Instead, sometimes it is those that really acknowledge the need for this shared experience among the audience, where success is most deeply achieved. And so we find ourselves in the fortunate circumstance where we work with the world's greatest designers on occasion, and can arrive at outcomes that are unique one to the next. No necessarily recognizable threshold design style, but instead the collection of outcomes that celebrate the uniqueness of each opportunity, all of which need to occur in a way that is acoustically valid. And for us, that is where the real opportunity lies, and what we seek to provide in each of the venues. These last few that are cycling through are projects that we're either in the midst of or that we have completed. And they represent what we think are the greatest opportunities to create uniqueness and experience that people can share together in a public way that is really worth showing up for. With that, I would say I'll let that play in the background, but ultimately, one of the most stark realizations we've had in the last 5 years or so has been that regardless of all of this, one of our jobs is also to create buildings that rest lightly on the planet. That nowhere in my acoustic education did anyone point out that it was important that we not use up the resources of the earth, or find ways to build buildings that are either low energy use or give back, and are created in a way that will be here for decades and centuries to come, so that they're not drawing too deeply on the resources, the scarce resources that we have in our surroundings. And finally, as a business owner and as a person responsible for the directions our company takes, and as a leader within our acoustics industry, the acoustics profession takes, the additional realization that it's really important that we assure that we're bringing in the best talent and awareness of diversity that we can get, so that the work we deliver is meaningful for our for the full population that we serve. And those things turn out to be really, really hard. And so we're working our way through, both as an organization in the National Council of Acoustical Consultants and the Acoustical Society, and us as a firm working in this discipline, to make sure that we can influence those big topics in the world at the same time as we focus deeply on communication and space for communication. So with that, I'll turn it over for any questions, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Scott. The presentation was great. Does anybody have any questions? And we'll monitor the chat if anybody has anything they want to. Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, first, I just want to say, Scott, thank you so much for this presentation. I gained so much insight and appreciation for the person and the humanity that comes with architectural acoustics that I did not appreciate before this listening to you. So thank you.
Pleasure.
My question is more maybe a naive one, but it's, I think, an opinion answer. You talked about designing things sort of from scratch based on people's experiences in other venues. And then you also talked about renovating. And I was wondering, do you have a preference or an excitement or an appreciation more for the renovation versus the building from scratch, or vice versa? I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So our office is made up of people with various backgrounds. Mine, as mentioned in my bio, is really from an acoustics perspective. Physics was the degree I studied, and music together. And so the physics person in me is a problem solver. And so for me, and I know nowhere in that education is there design, that. So I would say that for most of my career, I have felt that renovation was much more interesting to me, both because it was a problem solving exercise. You went in and you saw that there was an existing thing that was not doing what it was supposed to, and you could both analyze what it was currently doing and what you wished it was doing, and find a path to connect those two so that you got to the result. And so for me, renovation has always been more navigable, more part of my core skill set. But there are other people in the office who come at this with a design background, with architecture as their foundation, and then acoustics as an add-on to architecture. And in their case, they're very comfortable with that blank piece of paper that says, where do we begin? Over time, I have become to see new construction as problem solving of a different kind, and I've gotten very comfortable with either one. So I enjoy them both. But I think that natural gravitation towards one or the other comes from your comfort level, depending on what path you take to get into this arena. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, do we have any more questions for Scott?
I have 5 or 7.
Go ahead.
Hi, Scott.
Hello.
Great talk. And if you're going to be in Seattle,
I am.
Then I'd love to chat with you more, because I think the questions I have are too in depth. First comment is that I'm glad that I finally found what I want to do with my life. And so if we can switch an underwater acoustic sort of background into your world, I'll be watching your job openings. So anyway,
Okay.
so I have actually 3 questions, and I know there are probably others. I see a chat. Oh, maybe not. I have 3 questions, and the one we might have to table until Seattle
Okay.
about your models. And I know this is not the talk to get into the details, but I'm just warning you that if I run into you, and I hope I do, I'd
yeah.
like to chat more in depth about the modeling that you do, and
Sure.
comparisons with real world measurements. Because
Mhm.
that's, I had a PhD student who came from the architectural world, and that was an issue, both diffusers and the flat surfaces. And I'm guessing it's got a ray-based model.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave that for now.
Okay.
Um,
Let me just say one small answer to that, the nature of the direction of the question. Those models are completely imperfect.
yeah.
And we know the degree to which they're imperfect. And we tell our clients all the ways we know that they are imperfect. And so we always listen for differences only. And we never promise that we're playing for you what it's going to sound like when you get to your room. But we, as an analytical tool that says, we promise that everything has been done the same except for these listed differences, then you can start to have a conversation about what geometry means for the way a room might sound. And so
that's a role for students or projects or tie-ins to the physics, I guess, which would interest you, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
So the 2 questions I have that are maybe easier to answer is I see immediately in what when you showed the concert halls, you showed them empty often, and placement of people as diffusers and absorbers and the numbers of peoples and where they sit. I know it's not just the small scale things and the large scale things and the flat surfaces, where those people are and how many there are, for 2 reasons I think is important. One is acoustically, and one is how to keep them engaged visually with what's going on. So if you could maybe comment on both of those aspects, that's both my questions sort of rolled into one.
Sure. Yeah, there's no question that the audience makes a huge difference in the way a room responds. And a lot of times the photographs are more readily available when the room is empty. But certainly we have to pay attention to the presence of people and what that will do to the nature of the sound. Ultimately, our goal is to assure that, I'll look for a good example, that the audience, while we know they're going to impact the sound, there's a couple of things. One, there was one time a theory that you should make the seats absorb the same as the people, because then when the people come in and they cover up the seat, you get no change in the absorption and the room is more similar. Turns out that's not at all the case. The people and the seat become additive. And if you make the seat the same absorption as a person, you just get twice as much absorption, and the rooms have to get bigger and more voluminous in order to present a similar acoustic outcome to what you're after. So we minimize the absorption of the seat to a point, not so much like with Boston Symphony Hall where it's vinyl, and in a vinyl seat circumstance, then the room gets wildly reverberant in the empty condition, and you have to calm it down just to rehearse normally. So we minimize to a point, and then we're looking to make sure that the presence of services that deliver energy to those seats don't count on grazing incidence paths across the audience, because we're not going to have those. Those are going to go away. And so we have to provide surfaces and directivity in the room response that essentially recognize the fact that there'll be a big obstacle in place most of the time. If those 2 things sort of get at what you're after. The engagement of the audience ultimately comes down to, for us, acknowledging the theater consultant's role and saying, make sure that, a lot of our competitors compete with the theater consultant over flatter rakes of audience to reduce the exposure of absorption. But what that also can do is really disconnect people from the stage, because their sight lines aren't as good. They're not as, the visual part really does count. And so we're making sure that we're balancing those needs in a way that keeps the audience connected visually as well as acoustically, and recognizing that it's not good enough if it sounds perfect, but you can't have the full experience. So those become important.
That must get into your Post-it note, your meetings and trying to balance all the competing interests.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I'll shut up now. I hope to run into you in Seattle.
I'll look forward to that.
Okay, anybody have any, what time is it here? Any other questions? If you want to put them in the chat, if not. Okay. No, I don't think so. Okay, well, Scott, thank you so much. That was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. It was quite a bit different than what we usually do, which I think is really, really good.
Exactly.
I hope so.
Agreed.
I loved it. I loved it so much because it's so different from what I do. And I have an appreciation for something now that I just didn't understand enough to appreciate in the past. So thank you.
Well, good. Well, it's my pleasure. And so if I'm ever in the neighborhood, I'll come to the school. I'll look for some of you in Seattle. And thanks so much for the time today.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Scott.
All right. Take
I
care.
have one more announcement before we close this for good. I just want to remind people that CARE, the Center for Acoustics Research and Education, has an all-hands meeting on Friday at noon. If you're on campus, it's at Morse Hall 301. If you're off campus and part of our community, there's a Zoom link, which was in the email Jen sent out on October 1st. So we hope to see you all there. And if you're local, there's a bonfire at Jen's house, I think it's 7 o'clock. Is that right, Jen? On Friday night.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Scott.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care all.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.